On the cold evening of December 25, 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev sat alone in his dimly lit Kremlin office. With a heavy hand, he signed the document that would erase the Soviet Union from the map of the world forever. He then handed over the nuclear briefcase, the device controlling nearly 45,000 warheads, to Boris Yeltsin, the man who would soon lead a nation that did not yet officially exist. The very next evening, as winter darkness blanketed Moscow, Soviet soldiers lowered the red hammer and sickle flag from the Kremlin dome for the final time in history. A superpower that had terrified the planet for nearly 70 years, commanding the largest army on Earth, stretching across 11 time zones, and vowing to bury the capitalist West in the ash heap of history, simply ceased to be. And remarkably, not a single American soldier had fired a single shot to bring it down. This is the story of the longest and strangest war ever fought. A war waged not with bullets, but with dollars. Not with missiles, but with microchips and ideas. Not with invasions, but with extraordinary patience. This is the story of how the United States of America quietly, methodically, and brilliantly dismantled an empire, without ever declaring war on it. If you love deep, untold history like this, hit that like button right now and subscribe. It really helps these videos reach more people. Let's begin. The strategy that would eventually kill the Soviet Union was not born in the Pentagon war rooms. It was born in a diplomat's office in Moscow in February 1946. George Kennan was a brilliant American Foreign Service officer who had spent years observing the Soviet system from the inside. He had seen its paranoia, its brittle authoritarian logic, and its deep internal weaknesses. When Washington asked him to analyze Soviet behavior, Kennan responded with what became known as the Long Telegram, an 8,000-word masterpiece that would shape American foreign policy for the next 4 decades. Kennan argued that the Soviet Union was not the unstoppable juggernaut it appeared to be. It was a structure rotting from within, held together only by fear, propaganda, and lies. The United States did not need to invade Russia or bomb Moscow into rubble. All America had to do was draw a firm line, contain Soviet expansion, and wait. Over time, the internal contradictions of communism, its economic inefficiency, its suppression of the human spirit, would tear the system apart from the inside. It was an elegant, almost surgical theory. But it demanded something Americans were not famous for: the patience to fight a war measured not in months or years, but in generations. The first major test came quickly, in the divided city of Berlin. In June 1948, Joseph Stalin ordered a complete blockade of all road and rail routes into the western sectors of Berlin, trapping over 2 million people. Stalin believed he had forced America into an impossible choice: abandon Berlin and look weak, or break the blockade and risk starting World War III. What Stalin never anticipated was America's third option, one that would make him look like a fool. For 11 grueling months, American and British aircraft flew around the clock, landing every 90 seconds, even in snow, fog, and total darkness. They delivered more than 2 million tons of food, coal, and medicine. Soviet soldiers stood helplessly at the edges of the runways, watching plane after plane thunder overhead. They could not shoot them down without starting the very war they could not win. In May 1949, Stalin quietly lifted the blockade, having achieved nothing except proving that when the Soviet Union bluffed, America would call it. That same year, 12 nations signed the North Atlantic Treaty in Washington, creating NATO, a military alliance that wrapped around the Soviet Union like a steel noose. The cage George Kennan had envisioned was beginning to take shape. Throughout the 1950s, the CIA waged a global shadow war, toppling governments leaning toward Moscow and supporting those that faced west. In Iran in 1953 and Guatemala in 1954, American agents sent a clear message: communist expansion would be challenged everywhere, even in America's own backyard. When the Hungarian people rose up against Soviet rule in 1956, Russian tanks crushed the rebellion in the streets of Budapest, killing thousands. The West watched in horror. But the Kremlin had made a catastrophic mistake. The brutality was broadcast worldwide, exposing the violence required to keep the communist empire together. America didn't need to intervene. The Soviets were condemning themselves in the court of global opinion. Then the battlefield moved to the stars. In October 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, a small metal sphere that beeped as it orbited Earth. It sent shockwaves of fear through America. For a brief, terrifying moment, it seemed the future belonged to Moscow. But what the panicked American public didn't realize was that this space race would become an economic trap for the Soviets. Their command economy could achieve spectacular single goals by throwing every resource at one target, but it could never sustain broad technological progress across an entire society. Every ruble spent on cosmonauts was a ruble not spent feeding hungry workers or modernizing collapsing factories. America responded by creating NASA and committing to land a man on the moon before the decade ended, a challenge that perfectly played to American strengths: innovation, private enterprise, and industrial power. On July 20, 1969, Neil Armstrong stepped onto the lunar surface and planted the American flag where Soviet cosmonauts would never stand. Moscow had spent billions trying to win the space race and lost spectacularly in front of the entire world. The psychological wound would never fully heal. But rockets were not the technology that would doom the Soviet system. That honor belonged to something far smaller: the transistor, the integrated circuit, and the dawn of the computer age. While American labs in California and Massachusetts raced forward, Soviet scientists, isolated behind the Iron Curtain and strangled by central planning, fell further behind every year. In 1961, the Soviets revealed their deepest weakness in the most humiliating way possible. Instead of competing with the bright lights and prosperous shops of West Berlin, they built a concrete wall topped with barbed wire to imprison their own citizens. The Berlin Wall became the ultimate symbol of a system that could only survive by preventing its people from leaving. 1 year later, in October 1962, the world came closer to nuclear annihilation than at any other moment in history. Nikita Khrushchev, in a reckless gamble, placed nuclear missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles from Florida. For 13 tense days, American warships blockaded the island while Soviet ships steamed toward the quarantine line. In the end, it was Khrushchev who blinked. The crisis revealed a truth that would echo for decades: when truly pushed to the brink, Moscow would retreat rather than risk total destruction. President Richard Nixon understood that the communist world was never truly monolithic. In February 1972, he flew to Beijing and shook hands with Mao Zedong. Overnight, the strategic map of the world changed. The Soviet Union now faced a hostile China along a 4,000-mile border while still confronting NATO in the West. Nixon had split the communist bloc with diplomacy, something 100 army divisions could never have achieved. By the mid-1970s, the cracks in the Soviet foundation were spreading rapidly. The command economy, which was supposed to prove the superiority of socialist planning, could not even feed its own people. Every year the USSR was forced to import millions of tons of American grain, a profound humiliation for the so-called workers' paradise. Eastern Europe, supposedly grateful allies, had become an enormous economic burden. In 1975, at the Helsinki Conference, Soviet diplomats signed accords that included human rights provisions in exchange for Western recognition of post-war borders. The Kremlin thought it had won legitimacy. Instead, it had handed dissidents a powerful weapon. Groups like Charter 77 in Czechoslovakia began holding the regimes accountable to the very agreements Moscow had signed. In 1978, Polish Cardinal Karol Wojtyla became Pope John Paul II. When he visited Poland in 1979, over 1 million Poles gathered to see him. The seeds of the Solidarity movement were planted that summer. In December 1979, the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, expecting a quick victory. Instead, they walked into a decade-long meat grinder. The CIA's Operation Cyclone armed the Mujahideen with billions in weapons, including Stinger missiles that turned Soviet helicopters into falling fire. In 1981, Ronald Reagan entered the White House determined not just to manage the Cold War, but to win it. He launched the largest peacetime military buildup in American history. The Soviets, with an economy less than half the size of America's, were forced to match it, spending up to 25% of their GDP on defense while their civilian economy starved. Reagan signed directives to break, not just contain, the Soviet Union. The CIA poisoned Soviet stolen technology. Oil prices were deliberately crashed with Saudi cooperation. Star Wars terrified the Kremlin because they knew they could never afford to match it. Chernobyl in 1986 exposed the system's lies to the world. Voice of America, rock music, blue jeans, and Hollywood films eroded the ideology from within. The Miracle on Ice in 1980 and Olympic boycotts added to the psychological blows. By 1989, the pressure became unbearable. Poland held semi-free elections. Solidarity won overwhelmingly. Hungary opened its borders. The Berlin Wall fell on November 9 as crowds simply walked through. The Velvet Revolution, the execution of Ceausescu, the Baltic Way, the dominoes fell one after another. The Kremlin, exhausted and broke, did nothing. In 1991, a failed coup, Ukraine's independence vote, and the Belovezh Accords sealed the Soviet Union's fate. On Christmas Day, Gorbachev resigned on television as president of a country that would cease to exist the next morning. That evening, the red flag came down for the last time. The Soviet Union did not fall to armies or bombs. It fell to exhaustion, bankruptcy, technological backwardness, and the loss of belief among its own people. For 45 years, America waged a war of patience, economic power, and ideas, trusting that the system Kennan diagnosed in 1946 would eventually destroy itself. Containment built the cage. Technology outpaced a copying economy. Afghanistan bled them dry. The oil crash starved them. The arms race and Star Wars broke their budget. Freedom and abundance won the hearts and minds behind the Iron Curtain. The hammer and sickle came down not because America invaded, but because America endured. Because it built a system that could outlast, outspend, and out-innovate any tyranny. The Cold War proved that some victories require no shots fired, only the wisdom to see your enemy destroying himself and the patience to let him finish the job. If this story gave you a new perspective on history, smash that like button, subscribe for more, and tell me in the comments, what do you think was the single most important factor in the Soviet collapse? I read every comment. Thank you for watching. See you in the next one.